Okay, so in this video, I just wanted to review some ways of dealing with some of the input coming from uh, various practice problems. So I've just picked out a couple that will kind of illustrate a few techniques you can use in Python, and they're they are. I won't go through with the solutions. All I'll look at are a couple of different ways to deal with getting some of the input. So the first one I'm looking at is fractals, which is actually a really neat problem. It's 10 points. So if you've been working with the Don Mills online judge, you might have a feel for the difficulty level, and it's always worth looking underneath this problem type description to see what they're thinking about, but or what they're indicating, in what general area the solution falls under. But all I'm really interested in right now is how to deal with this input. So sample input are these three numbers, and let's just look at a tiny bit of code to figure out what those numbers will look like. So we can just grab them from raw input, and there'll be a string. So if I were to run this and just paste in that exact input from the example, then I'll end up with a string called nums. Sorry, I've lost my. Here I am. So I end up with a string called nums, and what I really need are three different integers, not a string containing these. And you can go through, so many different ways of dealing with this, but list comprehension, I think, is a really fantastic tool for a lot of these problems. There's a lot of places where you need to, it makes your solution much simpler, and this is one of those places. So what I want to do is turn this into three different numbers, and I'm going to start by doing this. This is basically, it's a list. It's a tuple or tuple, but it's basically three variables, and I need to kind of loop through all of this stuff in nums and turn them all into integers. So let me back up a moment and just kind of review a couple of things. First of all, nums is a string with all of these string methods that are associated with it. So one of them that's important, and which is a little hard to see why we need to use it right now, is strip. There's in fact a new line at the end of the input. Typically when you receive it from the judge, is going to have a new line in it if there's another line coming after it. So this example really should look like, num should really look like this, with the new line character, which is \n. That is usually what you're going to end up with. And so what you do is you call this strip method, and it just removes the new line if it's there. So there's no harm in doing this. It's actually probably something that you should do regardless each time you receive a line of input. So I'm going to do that, and then on the result of that, I'm just going to continue with the dot notation, and I'm going to call split. Now split's going to, by default, it's working with split takes a string and chops it up into several substrings based on a particular delimiter, and by default the delimiter is going to be white space. So I didn't pass in a space character, but I could, and I would end up with the same kind of output. I could put anything in here. I could chop it up based on the number 2, and what you'll notice is that we'll end up with a 3 and a space, and then the 2 goes away because it's in fact the delimiter in this case. It's the thing that is looked for that separates the two other strings, but itself isn't part of those strings, so it's removed, and then what we see after the 2 are 7 space 5, and that's what we have here. Now, and something else to remember is I'm not actually changing the value of the variable nums. I'm just calling these functions on the string itself, and then I'm going to do something with it. So it's this version of it that I'm going to work with. And this is in fact a list of 3 values, and we're very close to what we need. The only problem is that these aren't actually integers. So I'm going to use the list comprehension to turn these into integers, and then I'll end up assigning these into separate variables, because that's going to be a more useful way to work with them. And there you can see it's the string version, but there you can see I can use this this tuple assignment with the 3 variables in it, as long as I end up with a list of integers is what I want, and then they'll all get assigned into the various variable names. So this is the magic of list comprehension. So I'm kind of using list notation with the square brackets, but I'm looping through, the list that we were looking at here, the list of strings. This is generating that list of strings, and I'm basically writing a for loop with this n as my accumulator variable, and I can kind of filter that by stating, if I were just wanting to return what each of these was without any kind of modification, I could just use the accumulator variable there, and I would end up with a string which would look exactly like the string that I have. But what I really want to do is I want to use this kind of filter as an opportunity to run these all through a conversion to integer. Now that doesn't look like a big deal, or maybe it seems like a kind of roundabout way to actually get to this situation, but I think once you've done it once or twice, it really becomes easy to use, and suddenly list comprehension becomes a really useful tool in all sorts of different places. So there's my 3 values. So I would pull this back and place it in my code, and really I would just end up replacing this with the raw input, so that I can do like this. So now it's kind of all coming in. I'm getting my 3 values and they're all going. I'm just going to run that code. So this was the what did I do wrong there? One thing about spiders, I often end up pasting data into the wrong spot. So there you can see the version that we had here. Well, that's why I pasted it in the wrong spot. And so in one line, we called raw input. We stripped any new lines off of it, split it. We have a list of strings at this point. We looped through it within this list comprehension, turning each string into an integer, and then pass those back to this tuple, which chop them up into the various variables, and we have the 3 values in the various variables. This really allows you to just get directly to the kind of the meat of the problem, because dealing with these inputs, it's very very common that you end up having to deal with input that looks like this, or maybe input that looks like something like this. This is another really great problem, actually. This is a recursion problem, or recursion is useful to kind of determine the size of each room, and they're saying it's a type of graph as well. So what these are 3 different values. This first value doesn't really relate to the map. It's having to do with the problem itself. And then I believe the 14 and the 16 are the dimensions of the map that's about to come up. So the second line contains an integer that represents the number of rows. So we're looking at 14 rows by 16 columns. So I'm just going to pull this back up into Python, and I really like to use just the triple quotes and paste my input in there, so I have something to look at while I'm writing some code to deal with it. So I'll need to get rows, I'll need to get columns. I need to turn these into integers, so I really should have done it that way. And the other number at the top. So, and then we need to get this map. So I'm going to start with the map as a, map's a function. Sometimes I just call it game board. We need to get, 14 lines or whatever number of lines of data out. So it's going to be a list. We're going to use a list, and we're going to loop through whatever the number of rows is and read in another line and dump that into our game board. So now, if you want, and let's just make sure this is working fine. I'll just take this and run it and paste it in here. So that Z number was there, the number of rows is there, and the map or the game board is here. The game board is a list of strings, and each string has been left in its been left as a string. Strings and lists are both sequences, so you could go to the trouble of chopping up this string of i's or i's and the periods into lists themselves, but because they're both sequences, it really doesn't make any difference, I don't think. And functionally, in terms of your code, it doesn't make any difference. Maybe at some point, in terms of speed, it might. I'm not sure, but really, in this problem, it's not an issue. This map is fairly small. So we're looking. If we look at the first row of the map, let's look at the second row, since it's a little bit easier to see positionally what's going on. And if we want to pull out the first period, which is index 1, then we can just do that with the string. It doesn't. We don't need to chop these up into different elements of a list. The code looks exactly the same. So I would recommend not bothering to do that. But I'm going to do it anyways, and just as another opportunity, just kind of run through a list comprehension. But sometimes you do want to do that. Maybe you do need to deal with these as separate integers, perhaps, and maybe you'd rather have them in there in that form. So again, you could do that in a couple of places. Let me just deal with one row to begin with. So row, so I've kind of replaced my other variable row, but that's fine. So I'm going to pull just the full row, the second row. And so it's going to be the same thing. We're going to loop through, whatever it is, R and row, and use list comprehension. And in this case, it would be kind of one of these rare cases maybe where we just use the accumulator variable, and we just kind of use it to basically chop it up. Again, there's many ways you could do this, and I'm just thinking if there's a easier way with a string, but the split doesn't work, I don't believe. Maybe someone needs to kind of correct me on this if there's a way to do it, but there is no delimiter there to split it on. So that's the problem in this case. So the list comprehension works just fine. But again, the functionally from the coding perspective, you really don't you don't even need to think about it. They're both sequences. The list is a sequence and the string's a sequence. So that map or that game board works just fine with your various coordinates to access it. And one final thing, just as a final reminder, your row basically is kind of your y variable. When you're thinking about this as a kind of map, if you're remembering that 0, this position here is 0, 0, it's your origin, it's top left. But your first coordinate in the listing on the array is the row number. So it effectively is your y coordinate. So you kind of always have to remember to flip those around whenever you're accessing data out of your array. Anyways, that's just a bit of kind of a variety of things around dealing with input that I think are useful. I think the list comprehension is very useful for chopping things up, and of course unpacking things with the tuple it can be useful as well. And hopefully this kind of makes your job a lot easier of getting to the actual core of the problem.